And next week we're on. And next week we're on break. So next week is actually Easter Monday. So we have no class Easter Monday. But we finish this bit then, this first section of the course, with a truly fabulous guest, Paddy Hoey. How are you, Paddy?
I'm okay. My voice is a wee bit hoarse because I saw 7 goals the weekend, Mark.
Were you actually there?
I was, yeah.
Oh, lovely. Very nice. Super jealous of that. Paddy, amongst other things, was previously the Associate Director of ICE, of the Institute, for I don't know, what was it, 40 days, Paddy? I can't remember.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah. It was Brian
For a period of time.
Leeds,
Yeah. Anyway, we're delighted to have Paddy. Paddy is a true stalwart of all things cultural, and teaches at John Moores University at the moment, and he is a journalist, is probably how we describe Paddy, a journalist and a citizen podcaster, or a guerrilla podcaster. Or Paddy will explain to us all about podcasting. Anyway, Paddy is going to take us through podcasting this week in our journey on how to develop your own creative digital business, and hopefully we'll have lots of questions for Paddy when we come out the other side. I'll leave you to it, mate. I'll leave you to it here, right? But over to you. Okay.
How much do you want me to do? Do you want me to do like an hour, or is it 20 minutes?
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
Okay, great.
Give us your hour version, right?
I've loads here. I've got a wee PowerPoint I'll send through to Roz and Martin as well, which I'm gonna work off. So you can have those slides. So it's kind of a mixture of academic, so the history of podcasting and where I see podcasting fitting in with the kind of the history of digital, the history of the new digital world, where it fits with kind of new kind of dimensions of what is journalism now, perhaps, but also the kind of where podcasting is going to go, because we've had a mini kind of gold rush in podcasting, probably 2, and people in the major corporations are beginning to see a place, or at least a revenue stream for podcasting, and there was kind of mini gold rush towards around 2012, 2013, then another one towards the end of the last decade, and I think the corporations are beginning to see it, that there is a place for digital on-demand audio, as some people call it. So the context, I hate academics who spend 3/4 of an hour introducing themselves as if they are something, and I'm not. I just happen to be somebody who's loved radio and audio for a very long time, and started picking up the great old Greg Proops podcast before podcasting was even a term, going back to around 2001, 2002. Greg Proops produced some audio for Audible, which was then, this is prior to Audible, the audiobook company being bought by Amazon, which happened in 2006. And it all comes about obviously because of the development of the MP3 player, and then the iPod is the game changer, and that's where we get podcasting from. But all of Martin, it amazed me once. I was sitting in a workshop about getting research funding, and Martin pointed something out that I should have realized a long time ago, that as academics and as people who work in the creative industry, we turn our passion into our jobs. And I'd never thought of it from that point of view, that, to quote the great 1990 film, what do you call it? Robert De Niro plays Enthusiasms. But the Untouchables, sorry, when he plays Al Capone. Talk about our enthusiasms without hitting somebody with a baseball bat around a dinner table, of course. But the great thing about the context for podcasting for me is it's a genre or a format that allows people to indulge their enthusiasms. I come into it from fan culture. I'm currently writing a book about football fan culture, in which there's an entire chapter on podcasting. But as Martin has just pointed out, podcasting this is a form of media that will allow you to develop a nice little digital business if you have the right idea and a public, whatever that means, the word public, that is willing to monetize it to a sufficient level. The other thing about podcasting, of course, is that podcasting isn't going to be your main business. Podcasting is a brilliant way of adding value added, as we called it back in the days when I worked in the newsroom. When I worked in the newsroom and the digital world was beginning to kick off, I worked in radio newsrooms, but I also worked mostly in old school regional newspaper newsrooms. We always talked about multi-platform journalism, 360-degree journalism, and stuff that gave you value added. And podcasting is a wonderful way of developing value added to your primary offering to the market. So, for instance, if you're someone who's working in a community business, somebody who's producing some form of community limited company or something, then there's a space for a piece of audio or a piece of video, so a video podcast or a piece of YouTube. Is a brilliant way of developing 360 value-added content, which develops your digital footprint primarily, but also develops ways in which the public can get to you and interact with you. And again, before I get to my slides, one of my heroes is a guy called David Hepworth, who, if any of you remember, if you've ever seen Live Aid, he's the man that Bob Geldof swears at. Just give me your fucking money, because he was presenting Live Aid for BBC Two. That was BBC Two at that stage. And David Hepworth has edited Q, Mojo, Uncut, Smash Hits, all the great music magazines of the last 35 to 40 years. Hepworth has edited, and he also was a TV presenter on the old Grey Whistle test. But he is one of the great kind of digital pioneers of the music business, or the music press, or the music press industry. When he and Mark Ellen launched the Word magazine in 2003, which ran through to 2012. One of the first things they instigated was the Word magazine podcast. And Hepworth has always said that the podcast offers something different from your digital business. Is that while you're producing a magazine, or you're producing a newspaper, or you're producing a piece of something that has to be posted at a certain time, it has to be published at a certain time. The podcast allows you to have a very timely intervention in something quick. But he also pointed out that the key to any media business, whether it's publishing a magazine, publishing a newspaper, developing a television program, developing a web series on YouTube, is building a habit among those people who want to consume your content. How do you turn enthusiasm, how do you turn one view, which is, oh, that's quite good, into a habit where people wake up in the morning, turn on their phone, open their podcast app or open YouTube and see what subscriptions have dropped. Now, I want to reflect a bit on that, because I think that's where we talk about the relationship that you have with the people who produce the podcast, how you develop your personality for your podcast or your personalities. It might be, a regular YouTube show. I'll anything that's kind of digital, on demand, streaming kind of stuff. And it's produced by amateurs, or it's produced by non-corporation people. Then I think we'll keep that all under one umbrella. But I'm just going to share my screen because I'm beginning to wander off topic a bit. And I'd like to. Where are we? So I've got a brand new microphone. Does it sound okay? I've got a new podcast mic.
Sounds okay. You sound a bit far away, but maybe that's just me. Don't know what other people think.
Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me see. Zoom. Share. You can see it now, yeah?
Paddy Hoey started screen sharing. There we go. We get. Yeah, you just need to make that PowerPoint bigger, Paddy.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do that now. So everyone see that now, yeah?
Yeah, we're with you.
Okay, so the picture that you can see is what is often seen as the game-changing moment for podcasting as a viable art form or viable form of media. And the guy on the left is Mark Maron. Oh, by the way, can I ask a question? How many people regularly listen to a podcast here? Anybody want to stick
Lots
it
of
in?
hands.
Just open your microphone and who listens to podcasts
Yeah.
and what podcast? Go ahead.
Yes.
I've started.
Yes.
I didn't used to. I always used to just save podcasts that I wanted to listen to and never get to them. But then, because I have problems with sleeping, I have started to listen to people reading sometimes. I used to listen to.
Sorry, say it again. That you cut out there a bit. Am I frozen?
To people reading when I can't sleep. And another time I listened to someone just really just talking about all different things that we think about, like toxic in relationships, in family, in friendships, and all those sort of things. Just, analysing things and those sort of things, really.
Brilliant. And I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Is that you don't demand the same kinds of production values of a podcast.
I'm quite sporadic, so I think it doesn't matter to me. I'm just kind of
yeah. If you're listening to BBC Radio 5 Live or a radio station, or you're watching the news, you expect a certain type of production value, don't you? Whereas podcasts can be kind of rambling, they can be shambling, they can be, like Joe Rogan, they could be 2.5 hours.
Sometimes I like it when people are just talking because I guess as someone who can't sleep, sometimes you start to feel quite alone when it's quite late. So sometimes it's nice that someone's just rambling. And you're not even listening all the time sometimes, but it just has a voice.
That's a really interesting thing, which is the relationship we have between the voice or the people talking or the people producing and how engaged we are in it, because there are different types of podcasts where you have to be more engaged. And we use podcasts like we use television in different types of ways for different purposes. So this picture here is a picture of Mark Maron. This was when President Obama came and gave Mark Maron does kind of 1 hour in-depth interviews as opposed to 7-minute segments that you might get on 5 Live or on a talk radio station. And he regularly does like 1.5 hours with some people. But Obama came to, this is Mark Maron's garage, which he had tricked out into a recording studio, and talked to Mark Maron. And it was seen as the moment where podcasting kind of came from the margins and became part of the kind of global media diet. I would heartily recommend Mark Maron's podcast, WTF. It's regularly in the top 10 still. And if you want to learn something about interviewing and keeping a conversation going, then it's definitely something that you should listen to. Although he does tend to fall into that terrible pitfall now, which is comedians interviewing other comedians about comedy. I've had enough of comedians interviewing comedians about comedy. But anyway, it's a very good interview with Obama. So I do a podcast. It's infrequent now. Whenever lockdown started first, it was very frequent. We used to do one or at least one, if not 2 a week. I am part of an academic organization called the Football Collective, and as you can see, we're a group of people from a range of universities and a range of academic backgrounds interested in investigating the kind of role that football plays in our lives, whether it's from a legal point of view, a commercial point of view, accounting, it might be sports development, it might be exercise science. My area is media and fan studies, and I'm interested in activist media and how people use the media for activist purposes. And podcasting is one of the great opportunities for activists. And we've recently restarted this again. If you're not interested in football, don't listen to it, because it's for football academics. If you do like football, there might be some stuff in there. There's, I don't know, 50 or 60 up there on SoundCloud. So what do we mean when we talk about podcasting? So podcasting is for those of you who don't know, if you look at your smartphone now, particularly if it's an Apple phone, you will see that there is an Apple Music or an Apple Podcasts app, which when you sign up for podcasts, they will deliver on-demand audio to your phone via an RSS feed. Put a picture of an old classic iPod, because the old classic iPod was really the technological development which made podcasting so much easier, and saw an explosion in podcasting around the early sort of part of the 2004 to mid part of the 2000s, or the noughties as some people call them. A lot of the great podcasts like Kermode and Mayo, BBC podcasts like Fight and Talk and Kermode and Mayo, which recently just finished on BBC, all start around 2005, 2006. But the word podcast, to encapsulate the concept of on-demand audio which you, in media studies, we talk about, in technology, we talk about push and pull media. And push media are media that reach you, and they push themselves towards you. Pull media is media that you pull towards yourself, so stuff that you subscribe to and pull towards yourself. And in the early days, podcasting was very much a pull media, that you literally had to drag podcasts onto your classic iPod, or as I did when I used to run half marathons and do some boxing training. I would have an iPod Nano, which I would drop my Celtic podcasts and my Kermode and Mayo and Greg Pripps and various other people onto it. And it was coined, the term was coined by the BBC journalist Ben Hammersley, who's, if you're a real train spotter about new technology like I am, you'll know that he's married to Dr. Alex Krotowski, the technologist who does programs for Radio 4 and did the brilliant program, the Digital Frontier, which was a brilliant TV program which you can get on YouTube still, which the BBC produced around 2010 to explain the early age of the internet. And so it's a portmanteau word. It's a word that combines the iPod and broadcast. It's a broadcast for the iPod. It's a podcast. So with the invention of the MP3 device, whether it's the MP3 player in your phone, or whether it's a standalone MP3 player which you might have owned, whether it was an iPod or a Sony MP3 player or something like that. Once we dragged them on, everyone here who's had an iPod remembers dragging the music on for the first time and getting hundreds of records, hundreds of albums onto one, wee box that fitted into your pocket. Or now, with the invention of Wi-Fi and the invention of the smartphone, with the RSS feed, which you sign up to either via the podcast app or whatever your podcast catcher is, your podcast aggregator, if you use an Android phone, might be Podcast Addict or something like that, or SoundCloud, you get the program delivered to you. And from my point of view, what I'm really interested in is that podcasts are integral to a load of different forms of fan culture, whether it's football fan culture, whether it's sports culture, whether it's discussing Doctor Who or Marvel or something like that. The fact that you could produce your own audio and circulate that audio to people like you for next to nothing in terms of what are the barriers that you have at the minute which stop you recording a podcast? Well, some of those barriers are financial, because you need to have a podcast host, which I'll talk about a bit more in the towards the end of the session. Technically, there are very few barriers now facing you in terms of producing a podcast, because it can be as simple as turning on your MacBook Pro or having an app on your phone like Podbean, and you literally turn that app on, press record, talk into that app, hit a button at the end, and if you've got your podcast host, that will be out in the ether for someone to listen to. It's up to you to plug in all your socials to try and get it to a potential audience. But the point is that once, if you worked for a television station or if you worked for a radio station, there was a certain amount of kind of esoteric technical knowledge that you needed to produce that. When I worked in radio first, people were still editing with scalpels and bits of tape. Now that's not a barrier to you. Your first podcast may not sound as good as you want it to, but it's the practicing of it will make that better. Not having to learn any kind of esoteric skills. If you know your way around Adobe packages, if you know your way around Final Cut or Premiere or something like that, it's very easy to edit in Audition and Adobe. And there are loads of free free pieces of software out there, where like Audacity, for instance, which allows you to edit audio for free. So a lot of the barriers that we used to face to bring a product to market, to use a terrible phrase, or to get content, which is a terrible word, isn't it? Content devalues the whole kind of thing that we do. But to get content to the audience, all of those previous barriers that surrounded, like, for instance, fixed costs. You know, if I was involved in fan culture in the early 1980s or the early 1990s, and I wanted to get something to my football fan mates, well, I had to either A, record tapes or videos, I had to know how to edit them, or I had to have paper and go to a printer and produce a fanzine and sell that fanzine. Now I don't need that because I have social media to do that for me. And it's the same with audio. I don't have to go and try and get a radio program even on a community radio station. With a podcast, it's find the app, develop the content, send it to the audience, and get it to them via social media. Some of the key stuff, actually, I think podcasting as it was quite an anarchic art form. Podcasting, when it started, wasn't driven by profit. There wasn't the tyranny of the format. People, weren't producing kind of pieces of radio. A lot of the true crime podcasts that people might listen to now are just really sophisticated pieces of audio. Martin and Roz and Karen, I interviewed John Sweeney, the war journalist who some of you might be watching on Twitter in Ukraine at the minute. I interviewed him at Edge Hill just before Christmas, and he produced a podcast about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, and he persists in calling it a podcast, but it's just a really, really well-produced radio series that you happen to be able to download on demand. In the old days, podcasting was anarchic. It was kind of free form. It was just people sitting in a room talking to one another for a second. It was kind of free of genre conventions. You didn't have to fit in with a genre to fit in with some kind of categorization on iTunes or some kind of categorization on SoundCloud or Libsyn or one of the other hosting services. Podcasts were generally all free to listen, and in a very important way, most of the podcasts back in the olden days of the noughties were kind of directed by the audience, that there was a loop, a very kind of pure feedback loop between the people who were listening and the people who were producing. The journalists or the people who produced those podcasts were kind of, when people like Bourdieu would talk about cultural intermediaries, is that they understood what the audience wanted because they were the same as the audience. I'm going to use a very sad example today of the cycling podcast. Somebody I interviewed a couple of times about podcasting was a guy called Richard Moore, who recently passed away, very young. But Richard was a real pioneer in cycling journalism. He and his two mates, Lionel Burney and Daniel Freed, were real pioneers of cycling podcasting. And you think about cycling, it's kind of a big sport, but it's still kind of marginal in most countries, apart from France and Spain and Italy and Belgium, where it's like one of the major sports. Everywhere else in the world, it's quite a big sport, but still quite fringe. And so it has a lot of people who are interested in it, but they're just to the left of the dial, just off the kind of mainstream. And because they had, all three of them had ridden their bikes, Richard was an international cyclist, because they were deeply involved in cycling culture, they were respected cultural intermediaries. They understood what the audience wanted, and they developed a very close bond with the audience via the podcast. The same thing can be said in a lot of football club podcasts. Same thing can be said for podcasts like The Guilty Feminist, and a lot of podcasts produced for a kind of female audience, is that those people producing that are like their audience. They aren't a presenter on radio or television who's picked because they look a certain way or sound a certain way or have a set of professional skills. The podcast was directed by the audience and by the people producing it because they were similar. So whenever you produce your podcast or your nimble digital business, who are the people that you're trying to speak to, and how do they want to be addressed? On what platforms do they exist? You know, these are really fundamental questions for people who want to work in a kind of journalism communication space now. If you're producing content, you know, what style is it in? What's the content? Are you producing stuff that's relevant for your audience? How do you know? One of the ways you'll get to know is with a podcast, there's a real-time feedback loop. And I'll talk about that in a second when I talk about the Anfield Wrap, which is a Liverpool fan podcast. Now, of course, you know, David Harvey and generations of Marxist scholars have told us that where there is success, capitalism comes to colonize it. And where there has been success in the podcasting market, and the podcasting market is beginning to mature in its third wave. So it's part of a profit-generating media ecosystem. Podcasts are bought and aggregated by major corporations. Podcasts are used by streaming services to augment the offering that they have. I think one of the best podcasts names out there is the podcast that accompanies the Walking Dead TV series, which is called The Talking Dead. Brilliant. But it's part of a multi-platform universe, a transmedia storytelling universe. And you see the same thing happening in Marvel and Game of Thrones. Lots of podcasts are now quite generic, I think. Anybody who has looked at the British podcasting market must be sick of two male comedians talking to one another what happened to them last week. James Acaster and Ed Gamble will talk to Josh Widdicombe and somebody else and Rob Beckett about whatever, you know. So you can see that, like a lot of other markets that people produce media for, it has very quickly become homogenized to the point where, you know, there will have to be some kind of weeding out. Anyway, I think the other thing is that a lot of audio, digital audio, on-demand audio that call themselves podcasts are really just radio. Whenever Josh Widdicombe and Rob Beckett talk to one another about their parenting issues, that's just the equivalent of a Radio 5 Live show, or a 6, or the type of show that was pioneered on XFM by Ricky Gervais. Let's talk about the funny and wacky things that happened to us this week and then play a record from Suede or the Smiths or something. We can now see that people are now beginning to waken up to Patreon and making money out of podcasting. So you'll get a bit for free, but if you want to get the good stuff, you've got to subscribe to something like Patreon. And the older days, podcasts kind of just existed and popped up and might have been 2 a week or 1 a month or whatever. Now they tend to be scheduled and regular, and the audience in many ways is less important. The podcasters can get on without the audience. And 2 great examples, I think, of the anarchic early years of British podcasting were Andrew Collins and Richard Herring's podcast, which was just them sitting talking into a MacBook Pro for 67 minutes, because that's how long GarageBand allowed you to record in those days. And they just banged it up, no edit, they just went out. And I think Phil Wilding and Phil Dukas' Perfect 10, where the audience sent them in questions and they picked 10 questions out of a hat, it was filthy. Don't listen to it in a car with your kids. If any of you have children, I wouldn't recommend that. But it was completely freeform and anarchic. And podcast has become quite generic. That's something that happens in most media industries. So what does podcasting frees up a lot of previously static businesses. This is Richard, God rest his sweet soul, may God be good to him. Richard here at either the Tour of France or some tour, cycling journalist at some tour, speaking to Bernard Eisel, formerly Mark Cavendish's lead-out man if you're professional cycling fans. But journalists like Richard are now liberated from newsrooms. They now are able to, he's just carrying here a Zoom recorder, one of the recorders I'm recommending to you. Podcasting fits in with a broad ecosystem or ecology of plugged in content for you and your nimble digital business. Your podcast, your website, your social media channels, and anything else associated. So things like your YouTube, your Vimeo, etc., are all capable of being plugged in on one platform. And that platform, probably just an app on a mobile phone, is what you're going to aim for with a digital business. It's really important for building communities. I think one of the words that whenever we talk about readerships or viewers or listeners, or we're talking about the audience, what we're actually talking about is communities of people who are very similar. They like to laugh at the same things, or they like to listen to stuff about their interest. And actually, with the kind of intimacy of podcasting, which is you're never further than most people who listen to podcasts, listen to them either in their car or probably through a pair of headphones on a treadmill or walking their dog or doing some housework or something like that. And like radio, you build a very intimate relationship with the listener. And so podcasts are great at being the center of a community building exercise. And I think some of the examples I'm going to show you over the next 20 minutes are very interesting, I think, within that respect, because when we go back to David Hepworth's point about turning things into habit, one way of turning things into habit is to foster a very strong, parasocial relationship with people, that people believe that they've formed a bond with you through the podcast, through the things that you make them laugh with or that you're saying to them. I think that's really important. I think one of the tragedies of Richard passing away a couple of weeks ago is that the cycling podcast, like Kermode and Mayo, the old Radio 5 Live film podcast, a bit like the Socially Distant Sports Bar podcast I'll talk about in the next few minutes. A lot of the great podcasts are actually about friendship. They're about conveying the warmth that people have between one another, whether that's the presenter and the audience, or the presenters, the group of people involved in the production and the audience. There's a community and a parasocial relationship. That wonderful warmth of friendship that exists between people is what sells a lot of great podcasts. I mean, I think Martin's podcast is a brilliant podcast, the Lonely Arts Club. Not because he interviewed me on it, but and I still don't know why you did that, Martin. There you go. But whenever you listen to Martin's podcast, the great strength of Martin's podcast is the intimacy and the fact that he listens, and the fact that you get a real in-depth feel for the person who's being interviewed. And because it's not being cut down to small segments, they get a chance to speak at greater length. And that reveals quite a lot, in the same way as Michael Parkinson did the 1970s on TV in Britain, or Merv Griffin or someone like that in American television in the 70s. You get this real sense. It's not like Graham Norton, where there are a series of anecdotes being lined up to be told in no longer than 60 seconds, and there's a kind of forced bonhomie between people. Actually, podcasts allow you to talk about issues at length, and I think in a very intimate way, because, as I say, you're no further than that set of headphones away from the voice that's speaking to you. And this is the other thing about podcasting, is it's a bit like the kids from Fame, is that if you've got and it's really a quite minimal amount of kit, you can do it anywhere. It can be recorded anywhere. Martin does the Lonely Arts Club at Post in Liverpool, so it's in a really professional setting and it sounds great. But I like podcasts that sound a bit like they're like two bits of Coca-Cola cans being tied together by a bit of string. I love kind of ramshackle DIY punk ethos kind of podcast. This is the cycling podcast with Richard again. Richard, and this is Lionel and a French journalist called Francois Tomazeau. These are experts in the area of cycling, and every night during the Tour de France, they'll go and have something to drink, and before they have their dinner, they record 35 to 45 minutes worth of stuff on that day's stage. And that ability, that versatility to do it wherever you want to is really important. You don't have to have a recording studio. We'll talk about what you do need in a second, but it can be ad hoc. It can be instantaneous. It doesn't have to be scripted. This is the great element of podcasting, is that it can be ad hoc. It can be scripted, and it can be done really well, like Martin's, but it also doesn't have to be. what you need to do, if you are trying to add a digital footprint to your business, or perhaps you've got an idea for a podcast that you want to develop. The other great thing about podcasting is that you don't really need very much. Most people with a smartphone now, whether it's an Apple phone or an iPod, an Android phone, can download an app, something like Podbean, for instance, and you can talk into that, and it will send a keystroke. It'll stick it up in the ether for you. I know the Blood Red podcast done by the Liverpool Football Club podcast done by Peter Hooton, who's a friend of Carl Hunter's. You've obviously run into Carl on your course. They do theirs on an iPhone. They often record theirs on an iPhone and home baked before they go to an away game. Sorry, home baked, for those you don't know, is a community cafe on Breck Road in Liverpool, where a lot of Liverpool fans meet before games. If you want to do it slightly more kind of upmarket, if you look at Richard here and you look at Richard here, then what you need is a very good audio recorder if you want to make a top spec. So I'd recommend one of these Zooms. Probably you can get a decent Zoom for about 80 quid. That will, with a sound card, you can record on that, take the sound card out, plug it into your MacBook Pro or your PC, drag the MP4 or the WAV file, MP3 or MP4 off that sound card onto your MacBook Pro or your PC. Use something like Audacity. I've got a picture here of someone using, this looks like Adobe Audition maybe, or Adobe Final Cut, something like that, and do your editing on that. Okay, so it's really easy. If you want to, if you're away somewhere and you want to send it to someone else, those files obviously can be dumped on WeTransfer or Google Docs or something like that. So they're very flexible and malleable and can be sent. The good thing about an audio file is that it's generally quite small, so you don't have to worry about storing it up in the cloud if somebody else is editing it for you. The other thing, of course, is Roz is recording this call now, and Zoom will send you an MP4 file, which is a video file, and it will send you an MP3 file. And both of them, just the MP3 file, stick it through Audacity, take away. I hope Roz is going to take away all my ahs and ums and hesitations. And as you learn to edit those in something like Audacity or Adobe Audition, you'll be able to understand where the peaks and troughs are, and you'll be able to do it blindfold after a while, almost. Not blindfold, because you have to see the frequency. You know the point I'm making. So it really couldn't really be easier to make podcasts these days. As I say, something like Podbean, something like SoundCloud in your pop. If you download the SoundCloud app, you can record straight onto SoundCloud. Why is that important? Well, the one thing you need for a podcast is a podcast host. So back in the olden days, we might have used something like Libsyn or something like DivShare. Libsyn's still there. You pay them. I think they're all pretty much of a muchness in terms of price, somewhere between $7.99 and £8 a month, and they'll host for you. SoundCloud is good because SoundCloud provides a link straight to Spotify and to iTunes. Why is that important? Well, most people, if they do consume a podcast, increasingly consume them not on podcast apps like the old iTunes app, or on, I use Podcast Addict. I think it's the one I use because I use an Android phone. They're increasingly using the streaming services. So anybody who's on Spotify, there's a huge section on Spotify dedicated to podcasts. And the good thing about that, of course, is whether it's Spotify or Apple Music or Deezer or any of the other ones, or any of the other platforms, once you've subscribed to that, when you get up in the morning and you open your phone, it tells you which of your podcasts has appeared that morning. So that's important as well for building habits. If you want someone to listen to your podcast and you think, well, who is my, typically the guys on the Anfield Wrap told me that when I did some interviews for this book I'm writing, they were saying that their people who listen to their podcast tend to be a bit older. They tended to be people who were tech savvy. They tend to be people quite often work in white collar businesses. They work in they have computers in their work. They use computers a lot in their work. And they said to them that they built up a relationship with them so that they would listen to them on a treadmill, or they'd listen to them in the gym, they'd listen to them walking their dog. If they would get emails saying, Jesus lads, put a podcast up, we've got to go and do the ironing, or I'm taking the dog out. Because you're trying to build that into, make it habitual, make it that there's a part of the day. And you think about that, if you associate a podcast that you really enjoy with a space, whether it's the gym, the treadmill, the walk, whatever it is, then you're going to build that deep connection with that person. And that deep connection is something that you don't want to break. That's the key to all media businesses, getting people coming back to what you do in whatever way you do it. Let me get through some of that. We're not going to get through all of that. So it comes from what, yeah, we've done all that. So we've done all that. So the other thing you've got to think about, you can go through those slides yourself. I'm coming up to the last sort of 10 minutes. The thing about podcasting, the thing about the net, the thing about the net is that it has been increasingly difficult to get people to pay for stuff that they can get for free online. How many people on this call would like to work in the media business? I would say everyone on this call wants to work in the media business in some shape or form, given the fact that you're here tonight listening to my inane ramblings. However, every one of us on this call tonight has stolen a piece of audio, probably. Whether it's somebody, you might be like old thieves like me who used LimeWire or the Pirate Bay to steal music or television back in the day. Whether it's watching rights-free pirated stuff on YouTube. If we can get something for free, and the net, remember, is built on the notion of freedom. Conceptually, the internet is based on a Silicon Valley, Northern Californian libertarian notion of freedom. We talk about that the net being a kind of digital commons. There's places where people can roam free without regulation. They're old hippies, aren't they? But in terms of free, meaning not paying for something, how do you monetize something that you don't want to pay for? That's the real challenge for those of us working in media industries. I come out of newspapers and still love newspapers. Myself and Martin work for a newspaper called the New European, and it's achieved a kind of lovely niche for itself, managing to sell 20 to 30,000 copies every week, but relatively small numbers compared to the millions of people who used to buy a newspaper every day. Those days of that mass audience are declining. And in place, we're thinking about people can get anything they want, kind of generally for free. How do we monetize that? So do you use podcasting as a means of building your portfolio? So it's a loss leader. I will do this piece of audio because it develops my digital footprint, it develops my digital skills, and it allows me to give a broader picture of myself to potential clients. Or is this something that I'm going to try and do as a business opportunity? Now, if you're doing that, I wish you well. I don't know how many great business opportunities there still are out there for podcasting, because we're going through that third gold rush I was talking about, and we're seeing more and more podcasts being produced every year. But there are a number of ways that podcasting fits into the old ecology of the media. But first, in the new ecology of the media, podcasting has become a place where new media companies are beginning to grow around it. So, for instance, Spotify paid Joe Rogan hundreds of millions of dollars to produce his rambling, libertarian, legalized hot ramblings every week, whether it's his anti-vax meanderings or whatever his form of toxic masculinity. It's worth a couple of $100 million to Spotify, because Spotify think that Joe Rogan is going to drag people to their platform and pay for subscriptions. I'll just go back one slide. I think it's really important is that the Google model is an aggregation model in one way, which is Google is able to capture a snapshot of the net in every single second, and through its AdWords, monetize that. And in the first wave of decline in newspapers and the net in the early part of the 2000s, one of the things we talked about was how the aggregators, things like Google News, if you remember Google News, things like the Lad Bible now or Joe.ie, you know, those aggregators which take content from all the places and repackage it. The aggregators are going to be one of the big threats for newspapers, and actually have been a big threat. But actually what a lot of podcast companies now are doing is going out and paying podcasters who are doing decent numbers or a good enough number for them to pay them a wage or pay them give them a bonus. And so they're aggregating. And what we're getting is these de facto podcast networks. They operate like Radio 4, or they operate like the BBC or something like that. So you think about Acast, the big podcasts on the Acast platform are things like My Dad Wrote a Porno. Has anyone heard My Dad Wrote a Porno? Alice Levine's in that podcast, a brilliant podcast, well worth a listen to. Adam Buxton, which is one of the best podcasts on British in world podcasting, where Adam Buxton, the comedian, does really deep dive interviews with people. The most important, or the most historically important podcast in British sports podcasting, I would say, is Stakhanov. It was the Football Ramble, which started off with a group of people talking around a computer on somebody's kitchen table, and it really transformed the complexion of speech, audio surrounding football. We've got Muddy Knees Media, which does a totally football show. They're an independent. They just do their own. In the States, the really big ones are Stitcher, which Mark Maron and Conan O'Brien, Oprah are on. Earwolf, which you'll have a look at some stuff. Gimlet Media, which you'll see quite a lot of the big podcasters, a lot of comedians are on that on Gimlet and Earwolf. A really interesting one is Nerdist. Nerdist was set up by a comedian called Chris Hardwick, and produces stuff on. He actually produces the Talking Dead podcast for. Is it what's the Walking Dead on? Is it AMC? I think it's on the AMC network, or Showtime. But he set up Nerdist. That was just people talking about nerdy stuff, and he had a few podcasts on. That was bought by the Chinese company Wanda. And if anybody knows anything about Hollywood and China, Wanda has been buying up bits and pieces of Hollywood and various bits and pieces of Western media until the recent economic slump in China. So obviously they think that there's going to be a marketplace and there's going to be money to be made out of that. So the new revenue streams are already picked up by somebody like one of those networks, like Joe Rogan. The other way of monetizing your podcast is like the friends, like the cycling podcast who showed you sitting in that lovely town square or outside a restaurant in France, the Tour de France. So what I do is, or those of us who are friends of the podcast, we pay them 15 to 20 quid a year. Some people pay a bit more. It's a bit like the Patreon's the same. There are several different platforms, so you can pay a bog standard and just get a podcast delivered every week. You can pay a bit more and maybe get extra content, and maybe in the cycling podcast case, a free hat. You pay a bit higher. At a live show, you might get to meet the team, those sorts of things. So there's tiered subscriptions. Patreon is the one that really has taken off in the podcasting world. It's on a tiered basis. So I listen to Socially Distanced Sports Bar, which we'll look at very quickly before I finish off here. And for £4 a month, I get a podcast ad-free, but also with an extra half hour's worth of content and an extra podcast some weeks. Other podcasts offer opportunities for live shows and merch and stuff like that. You get the point. It works in the same way as you see crowdfunding. If you've ever been on a crowdfunding platform, that's exactly how Patreon works. The other is multiple sponsorships. The Anfield Wrap reaches around 13,000 people every week, several times a week. So for £8 or £9 a month, they produce 6 to 7 podcasts a week. So that's quite a large amount of content that's going out. So it's worth people's while. So a lot of digital businesses like Beer 52 or Harry's Razors, or if you listen to podcasts aimed at men, there's a lot of advertising of men's downstairs grooming products. I'll just leave it at that. Things like obviously clothing firms are interested in sponsoring football podcasts, given the fact that football fans, especially Liverpoolian people from the Northwest, like their clothes and their trainers and whatnot. Now, I think the really interesting area for those of you working in digital media and who might be working as performers or working with performers, that might be people working with comedians or people working with actors and actors. Journalists are getting in on the act. The Guilty Feminist, Deborah Francis White, brilliant feminist podcast, been on Radio 4 as well, but she has recently played the Philharmonic Hall in Liverpool and filled it. So that's 1,000 people all paying, say, between 25 and 30 pounds. Well, what's that, 30k every night? That's a good business model if you can make it work. You make it work because it's digital. Now, I love the socially distanced sports bar. This was set up by, from left to right, Ellis James, who's a Radio 5 Live presenter, Stefan Guerrero, who's a former Radio Wales journalist who now lectures at Cardiff Met in journalism, and Mike Bubbins, who's a comedian. And one of their ways of getting through lockdown was to record this podcast, which is nominally the three of them introducing YouTube clips and talking about it. But it's just three really good friends talking absolute mince, talking absolute nonsense. I wouldn't recommend you playing it in the car, by the way, again, as well. I sometimes have to turn it off. My wife comes into the kitchen if I'm listening to it on me, whatever, I have a Google Home device or whatever it is. But this is a picture taken at the Hackney Empire. And after lockdown finished, they built such an audience that they were able to play 8 or 9 nights. And it finished up, they played the Motorpoint Arena. So that's like 10,000 people listening to people talking to one another about sport, which I think is incredible, really. But it just shows you how the physical world and the analog and the digital worlds are coming together and providing new business models for people who were previously journalists or people who were comedians or producing content for radio. So I'll just finish up. I'm not usually this disciplined, folks. I've done slightly shorter than I'd normally still be waffling on about cycling podcasts from the early 2000s, if you'd let me, but I couldn't. Why do I think podcasting is interesting for those of you who want to be who are building sort of nimble digital businesses? This is from the US research. 500,000 active podcasts on iTunes and Apple. So there's a big problem there, which is quite homogenous. There's lots of it. How do you stand out? However, if you do manage to build yourself an audience, whether it's like our audience, the football collective has 400 people who download that podcast. We're not looking to make money. We're just looking to spread research. That's our intention, is to spread football research and interesting stories about from the football academic community. But the thing about even our audience is that they're highly active online and they're highly active on social media. They tend to be serious users of social media. They tend to be very active on things like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. They follow companies online, so then you can sell advertising to those companies. People who listen to podcasts tend to be skewed towards highly educated. They tend to have, at least in America, a college degree, if not postgraduate qualifications. They also tend to be very dedicated. They listen to everything. They will listen. So if they find a podcast which started 9 years ago, they tend to want to listen to everything. And the other thing about it is they tend to subscribe to other streaming channels. So that being able to diversify revenue streams through things like advertising tends to be easier for podcast audiences. So in the US in 2019, 51% of the population listened to a podcast, 49 are listening to a podcast. If you look to it, compared to stuff like television and radio, they tend to be very dedicated listeners. They're affluent, which is good for you if you want to sell advertising or partner up with an advertiser or some other form of commercial client. And they tend to be educated. And remember, folks, that the thing about podcast is, in the world of a smartphone, you're always in someone's pocket and you're always in someone's ears. Okay, that's me finished. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Absolutely wonderful stuff. I'm sure we have lots of questions about podcasting, but I'm going to start. And I know Daniel wants to come in. But I just want to say this one thing, since you said such nice things about my podcast, or about our podcast, because Roz is the producer Roz, I'm not sure if Roz has left the call or if she's hanging about the call. I'm trying to get Roz to come in the second half and certainly say some things about producing that podcast, because she's the one who puts it together and knows the technical stuff inside out. But it's that thing that you raised, Paddy, about sound, right? And I know we disagree on this, or we have different takes on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is when I wanted to do that podcast, when I started that podcast, it was from the start. I always wanted that crystal clear sound, which is, you described the BBC sound. So it costs, so it's not free for us to make. We go into the studio in Hartman Street and we record it, and we did 1.5 series over Zoom on lockdown, and you can tell the difference between those. The Zoom now, it's much better now to do podcasts on Zoom because technology's improved a lot in the last couple of years. But when you started doing Zoom podcasts, you could really tell the difference between doing something, recording stuff over the internet and having people on mics in the studio. But the reason I wanted to do that kind of quality sound is your point about intimacy, right? That if you are regularly letting somebody into your ears, then it's all about, for me, it's all about that sound needs to be good sound, right? And that's the thing I say about filmmaking, is we can forgive bad images, we can forgive ropey images, but in filmmaking you can't forgive bad sound. If you can't hear what's going on in the film, nobody's going to watch it, right? But you've got your take on sound is completely different in the stuff you do. Mixes a whole lot of different stuff. You do some stuff really quite quick, and in context that the sounds really quite rough. So just tell me a little bit about that, about the way that you do it and why you do it in that way.
Well, we do on the Football Collective podcast. We do have some high quality ones. We don't have the money to pay someone to go into a. I could probably use I can't go into a post facility. I can't go into I know people who own recording studios, but it seems to me, for what we do, which is getting people's research out, is that we're kind of, use a terrible cliche, we're using the hammer to crack a nut. I also come from fanzine background, Martin, as you know. I've come from a kind of very DIY kind of ethos, and I genuinely still get a childlike feeling of wonder. There's somebody who used to have an old typewriter when I was a kid. My parents indulged me, and I pretended to write stuff when I was quite young, like I told you that in the podcast. I just think it's amazing. And I used to do a banda machine. There's people on this call who are younger going, what's a banda machine? It's an old inky machine, like a stepper machine, which you used to crank your hand and would send out pieces of A4. So that's the context of my kind of thing, is I love that. But of course I know that having worked in radio and worked in mainstream commercial media, that there are times when that kind of stuff won't do. So it's like everything else, Martin. It's like a negotiation of manners. There's certain rooms you go into and you don't behave roughly, and where only your best behaviour and your best production will do. And there are other occasions where that's not kind of required. So I was producing a football fan podcast. I'm not saying go back to the bad old days of Skype. Remember the old ones people used to record in Skype, Martin, where they just sounded terrible. You know, the Anfield Rap said when they started their podcast that the first thing they were going to do was, well, their rule, which was no wolves and no wolves on Skype, which it had to sound authentically Scouse, and they were lucky enough that they knew people who owned a recording studio and it could be recorded in really good quality. And they built their own studio now, and it's brilliant. So I think you've got to think about what the occasion is, you know, what you want. So with the football podcast, during lockdown, for instance, we found a lot of people saying, God, like, you know, a lot of us were very close, and people were saying, oh, it's great getting a podcast like once a week. So I decided to do something called 10 by 10, which was 10 people working in football academia to speak for 10 minutes about their favorite book on football. And that came out, we did about 13 of them. That came out sometimes twice a week. And that was kind of rough and ready. I had a MacBook Pro, which is the old computer I had at Edge Hill, and I had either Skype or Google Hangouts or Zoom, if I could steal ICE's Zoom or somebody's Zoom, and or Skype, and we would just record very quickly. If the other person had a microphone, good. I had a microphone. I use I don't know if you can see. Can you see my screen? I use one of these, which is the blue, which is very good quality. It's only about 70 quid. And it captures a lot of stuff. You know, and so you have to. So ultimately, what I'm saying is, Mark, is like, you know, I think you have to understand what your podcast is for and who it is for. Sometimes it's a bit like having a style in a newspaper or a magazine. That style is predicated upon who you think your reader is, who you think your listener is, and what they want to accept. So yeah, for somebody coming from a sort of fan media point of view, I like sometimes recording things immediately, quickly getting them out. We did a lot of those on Zoom, which we put out on YouTube, which is right. Let's talk about Project Big Picture. Let's talk about the European Super League. Let's talk about football fans supporting food banks. And we'll get 4 or 5 people on a Zoom, record it, bang it out, get it onto YouTube, and get the audio up onto SoundCloud and Spotify. So it depends on the occasion, I think, is ultimately what I'm saying.
You've never had an issue with the quality control process at iTunes as a result?
No, never. I've never made anything that sounded like it was, you know, being recorded in a submarine somewhere in the Marianas Trench. It's usually listenable, like, you know. I mean, I suppose if you're our age as well, Mark, if you grew up with a radio in your bed trying to, you know, listen. I used to listen to American radio stations, and you'd have to. This is positively luxurious in comparison to that.
It's very true. So apart from just to say, apart from the recording, different ways to record the file, after that, the process is exactly the same. I mean what you then go to the edit, wherever you want to edit. You then upload it, and that's it. But the process after that, the process is exactly the same, and
every time. MP3 file or a WAV file. If you're using Audacity, for some reason, I don't know why this is, and I've asked friends who work in radio, sometimes an OGG Vorbis file works best. It's slightly bigger than slightly bigger than MP3, but smaller than a WAV. But SoundCloud OGG Vorbis format works best on SoundCloud. But in terms of editing, whether it's me or somebody else, I've restarted the football collective podcast again recently, and it's an MP3 file, and I will stick it into Audacity or Audition and go through it for ums and ahs. And whenever, I know Roz did this, whenever she started your podcast, she went through every single and ah and then after a while you realize, you've all heard me speak, folks, like there's a lot of ums and ahs. It would take me 5 hours to edit my podcast if I took out every kind of thing. So I don't mind. I don't mind letting it run because I think it sounds a bit more intimate anyway. Then when I get that finished, then that gets exported as an OGG Vorbis or an MP3. I stick that up onto SoundCloud. SoundCloud automatically generates a link to Spotify, and then I just in SoundCloud I tag it up with the file, a bit like doing an academic essay. or writing a journal article, the 5 keywords that you think people are going to be able to get to searching via hashtags and stuff on the net, and that's it. The net does everything else for me. Audacity I use. I like Audacity because it's so easy to use.
We've got a question from Daniel, who's been thinking about podcasts for a few weeks now.
Hi, Paddy. Cheers. Thanks for that. That was great. Really enjoyed your talk. My question was, as you mentioned, we're in a sort of a bit of another gold rush of the podcasting era. Where do you see podcasts going? What's the next stage? What will the future look like? And what do you think would be good to focus on or get into now for someone starting out to be ahead of the curve?
That's a good question. And if me and you knew that, would now be absolutely minted, wouldn't we? And it's difficult to look into the future. I think one of the conclusions that we're going to take out of Gold Rush Run 1 into Gold Rush 2 into whatever Gold Rush 3 is. Gold Rush 1 was when the industry actually found ordinary people. So if you think about what ordinary people were, that was who became known as YouTubers, the people who became known as influencers. And Gold Rush 2 kind of turned into where they became celebrities, but then celebrities found podcasting and Instagram and stuff like that. And then so one of the big problems is I think Gold Rush 3 is going to be it's Daniel, isn't it? I think podcast Revolution 3 is going to be kind of more celebrity focused. And I think it's also going to be more integrated into video. So what that is, I don't know. I don't think there's very much more we can do with fan media because it is just people talking after all. So it's one of the things I think is going to happen with podcasting is that increasingly fan-based media apes the kind of, or copies the types of formats that it sees in mainstream media. So if you look at things like Arsenal Fan TV or the Anfield Wrap, they now make their own versions of established media forms. So it's about, I think maybe the next kind of gold rush will maybe be around kind of aggregation, Daniel, and we'll see things like, if you look at like Jamie, for instance, Jamie Oliver, the way Jamie Oliver or Joe Wicks, for instance, uses YouTube, they kind of use those streaming services as kind of de facto TV channels, just not on TV. And I think that's what we'll find with podcasting, that they will become de facto podcasting networks. So for instance, you know, with Patreon, if I paid a Patreon of a $5 a month every month for all my favorite podcasts, it would cost me £100 a month. Well, at some point, somebody's going to come up with a bright idea of putting them together on a platform where I don't have to pay that. And so I think it's going to be around the organization and the aggregation of podcasts as opposed to people producing individual podcasts. It'll be in the industry of podcasting rather than that bright idea which comes up with a really interesting single idea for a podcast. So I was going to say anything, try and get into the podcasting industry or the audio industry as opposed to racking your brains for a brand new idea for a podcast that's going to knock it out of the park.
Great, cheers. Thanks, Paddy.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting what you mentioned about the fact that video might play a bit of a bigger part as well, and then when a podcast gets matched with, you know, people speaking on video as well, what is that? Is that something new? Is that something different? And you know, we got the rise of people on platforms like Twitch who are streaming, and they're essentially, most of your Twitch streams now are recorded as well, so it's like a little VOD. And it's like, in essence, can be a podcast as well, but has the benefit of interactivity too. So people in your chat you can talk to and respond to as well. So there's that feedback. It's people get to interact as well. But it's becoming something similar where people just stick on one in the background, like Megan said, just to have someone talking in the background, and it's that feeling of like company. That's audio paired with video and paired with interactivity as well. So I think that's something that it's quite an interesting amalgam as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Twitch, whenever the Twitch world is fascinating, isn't it? Because again, it relies on community building, doesn't it? Or whatever you mean by community, but it does rely on groups of people being sufficiently interested enough in two other people or one other person playing a game or whatever it is. Richard Herring does a good Twitch where he plays himself at snooker in his own house, and it's just mad, like, you know. But whether it's watching a Twitch or, so for instance, if you're watching a fight on a dodgy stream, I don't mean like lads fighting in Liverpool, I mean like, you know, a big boxing fight where you don't want to pay 16 quid to whatever it is. You know, whenever you see that community of people, you know, chatting shit to one another on the right hand side on Twitch, and the same thing when you're illegally streaming a fight, those are mini communities. And so whenever that Twitch kind of space begins to mature and we begin to understand more clearly how virtual communities actually function, because we cannot understand how they function, you know, algorithmically because of Facebook and Twitter and Google, because that's what those businesses are. They're data businesses. Once we begin to understand how we can kind of monetize that community and how we gather, you know, it might be lots of micro communities. It might be like, instead of having 5 podcasts that get 8 million people, you might have 40 podcasts that get 8 million people, if you know what I mean. But you don't have to have the same economies of scale as you have in the old, you know, the old analog media world where you needed millions of people involved in platforms. Every one of those wee mini, if you've got 100 people paying you a fiver every day to watch you playing games, that's 500 quid a day you're making. Of course, you take away your the Twitch fee, which will be what, between 5 and 7.5%, or your YouTube Google deduction. You know, it becomes a volume business then, Daniel. It's a bit like old school producing of newspapers, where you produce something cheaply but very, very regularly. And, you know, so I say, if you can get 1,000 people to pay you a fiver twice a week, that's £1,000 a week you're making.
I think that the same thing flows through that I think you mentioned at the very beginning as well with that. It's that, how do you get people to turn it into a habit? How do you get people to come back and think, you know, has Paddy done another stream? Has Megan done another? Is there a new VOD? You know, to get them come back and checking their feed to go, you know, it's like leave them wanting more. I'll talk about that next time. And you think, right, oh, okay, great. You know, I'm gonna log in next time as well. You know,
if you're in right wing talk media, then you do that by becoming increasingly hysterical about the woke agenda or something. You know, you see what happened to people like Katie Hopkins, where it comes to a point where the kind of balloon kind of has to explode because there's no more lunacy to fill it. But in my research, all the football podcasts, particularly the Anfield Rap podcast and the Celtic podcast that I've done, the reason why the audience is listening to it because they've forged an emotional link with those people on those podcasts. There's a warmth to their voice and the things they're talking about. They like and they were saying that they went to Melbourne in Australia, and this guy walked up to Robbo, who's one of the guys in the Anfield Rap podcast. He said, "What's home bake like?" And Robbo said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's this guy in Melbourne, Australia, because he loved the Anfield Rap podcast, wanted to go and buy a pie on Breck Road in Liverpool. That was one of his dreams, was to go." And because he said, "I know you better than I know my wife. I know you boys better than I know my own friends because I listen to you 7 times a week." And so it's that, like, again, we're back to that thing about intimacy, is that, you know, how do you show people that your intimacy is better than, or your friendship is warmer or is funnier when there are 500,000 podcasts on your podcast app? As I said, the 500,000 active podcasts in America. And if you go to your podcast app now on your phone, whether it's Podcast Catcher or something like that, you know, the only people, I don't know how you do this, Martin, but how do you make the Lonely Arts Club stand out when all people see on the front of iTunes, or all people see on the front of Apple Music, or all people see on their podcast capture is James Acaster and Ed Gamble and Snog Married Avoid, or whatever it is? You know, how do you make people? That's the other thing, Daniel, is you think is how do you make your stuff stand out?
I think part of the answer to that is have something that's completely different. You know, so the Lonely Arts Club is, strangely enough, a Scotsman speaking to Scousers who've made good in the cultural world, which shouldn't work in any way, but somehow it does. right? And it's a long format interview, and there's nothing else like it, really, right? So if that's your thing, remember we were talking a couple of weeks ago about TikTok, and there's a TikTok community out there for you, right? Whether it's people doing spoken word, whether it's people talking about web photography, people making their record labels or whatever it might be. There is a world on TikTok for you, so, and that's the kind of community that you need to find. If you find that community and you can monetize that community, it might only be 200 people, but they'll all pay you a fiver on Patreon, then you're away, right? We obviously do the Lonely Arts Club for free, but if you've got the numbers as well, you'll quickly go into advertising. You know, the numbers reaches a stage where you flips over and you'll be offered advertising for your podcast.
I have a friend called Dave Candler. He's now living in.
I just need to get a plug. Hold on, I'm going to run out of battery. Carry on, Paddy.
He lives in Croatia now, but he lived in South Korea for 2 years, and he used to be in a band. He's from Widnes. He's in a load of indie bands, and he got into Korean indie music when he got over there. And he said to me, "I'd love to do a podcast." He knew I was into them. He said, "What do you think I should do?" I said, "Just stick some bands out, and I showed him how to do it." And he did it via Libsyn, I think it was. He called it South Korean Homesick Blues. And he just he found like say 6 or 7 bands every week, unsigned, and he talked about them and played an MP3 of them. And on his Google Analytics, one week he found out that there was if you look at Google Analytics, it tells you everywhere in the world your podcast listened to. And he saw this one red blip in the middle of the Atlantic, well, just off the coast of Nigeria, about, 500-600 miles off the coast of Nigeria, in the middle of the Atlantic. And he said he wondered who it was. And this says something or speaks to the notion of intimacy. So he put a shout out on the podcast saying, "I've got this blip in the middle of the Atlantic, or just off the coast of Nigeria in the Atlantic. I'd love to know who it is who's listening to my podcast offshore in the Atlantic Ocean." And it turned out it was a South Korean engineer on an oil platform. And he was a young fella, he was hip, he's into his music, and his one link back to South Korea and the music he listened to in the area of Busan was a podcast produced by a fella from Widnes living in South Korea. And, you say a Scotsman talking to Scousers shouldn't work. Imagine being a Widnesian in South Korea talking to a South Korean fella about South Korean hardcore bands. And you see, that also speaks to, Dave didn't do it commercially, even though he's got a great voice and he's lived in America, so he sounds great. He sounded like he should have been the new John Peel, really, for my money. But if he had monetized that, he had a regular group of 1,000 people listening to that podcast every single week. And they're all people who are involved in bands, who are involved in the scene. And Busan is the university area near, in the kind of greater Seoul area. And so anywhere when there's any indie clubs wanted Dave to go along because they wanted to get heard on Korean Homesick Blues. So in a way, that the interesting thing about social media or online media and stuff like podcasting, Mark, I suppose, is that you can budget up and down. As you said, you don't need to have that big number because you cut your cloth to the number of people that are there. And, the likes of the socially distanced sports bar, which I think is wonderful. It's a riotous thing to listen to. They sit and talk for 3 or 4 hours, edit it down to 2 hours for the non-patrons, 2.5 hours for the patrons. And it took off because it speaks to a certain kind of working class Welsh maleness. And there's 2 comedians who are very funny on it. So the good thing about it is that it can be as small as you want it to be. And it doesn't cost you very much. And it can be as big as you want it to be. If you become Joe Rogan, who's to say that you won't become Joe Rogan or, or the Guilty Feminist or someone like, or Oprah. But it's one of the few forms of media where it can be as small as you want it to be. And, my academic way into this was thinking about small media, activist media and citizen media. And I think that's a really interesting thing about it. It could be something that you and your 40 mates listen to. That's all it has to be. Yeah.
mean, a good example. You gave two examples, Paddy, of things that grew. Right. One was Muddy Knees Media that was on one of your slides, and Muddy Knees Media started really as a breakaway from. They stole some talent from the Guardian.
Were you team Jimbo or were you team Baz?
Oh, it was like my parents divorcing at that point. I was like,
I'm always ST Jimbo. I'm always ST Jimbo. I think Jimbo's one of my great media heroes.
No, absolutely. AC Jimbo all the time, but I still go back and listen to Baz today. But and that company then eventually gets bought by The Athletic.
Exactly.
Now, all that stuff. So I mean, that's the other thing. You sell your podcast, right? That's the other way which you make money. But the other example is Podmasters, which started off. That's Andrew Harrison, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Andrew Harrison used to be a journalist at the NME.
We started off on the Word Magazine podcast.
That's right. Yeah, used to work for NME, and he's from McGull. Andrew Harrison, part of my thing. And the first podcast they did was called Romaniacs after the Brexit referendum. And again, it started off like a self-help group, right? Three or four regulars sitting around just talking, right? I've been on the Romaniacs podcast. I've been a guest on Romaniacs, but that grows from Romaniacs into, they eventually changed the name after Brexit to the flagship, that podcast now called Oh God, What Now?
Yeah.
Oh God, what next? Oh God, what I think it's called. But then they've got another spin-off called The Bunker, and they've got a Bunker Daily, and they've got a Bunker Saturday. So they've created this whole empire, which is partly funded now by Patreon. I think it's also, certainly in the early days, it was certainly Oh God, What Now? Stroke Romaniacs was funded by advertising when they got the numbers as well. But again, that's another, and they've moved into live shows as well, right? So that was all built completely independently, without a penny from a bank, without any support from broadcasting. It all came out of a show that grew its numbers and then became an empire and employs dozens and dozens of people now, and has lots of shows.
You think about, and they did Big Mouth, didn't they? The show that they started in Soho Radio, which has now become The Bunker, hasn't it? If you think about the Anfield Wrap, they have, say, 12, 13,000 subscribers, all paying, say, call it a tenner. That's £130,000 a month, isn't it? That's turning over, somewhere around 2 million a year. You've got your rent, and you've got, say you're paying, I don't know, 12 people on staff, £2,000 a month. They're not. That's 24 grand a month. They've become a bit like it's a bit like the new European market, that if you can get 20,000 people paying £1 and only costs you somewhere between 4 and 6 grand to produce with your fixed costs, mightn't be a massive business for a corporation, but it's a good, viable business in the model of small businesses used to be, going back more than a century. And that podcasting model, it can be done as they did, building it bit by bit. You could do what the Anfield Wrap did, which is by they've got investment from a guy called Wayne Bennett, who's from a Liverpool fan, but who now lives in Canada, who's invested in some digital businesses. Another really good example, this is very dude heavy, I apologize for any of the sisters on the call, but I think I'm brilliant. One of the top rated Patreon businesses is The Second Captains, which is basically a radio show, a podcast done by 3 sports journalists in Dublin. They also have an RTE show which runs for certain parts of the year, but they're effectively 3 Irish Times journalists who talk about Gaelic football, soccer, sorry folks, football, and rugby and American sports. And they produce a half-an-hour podcast every day and a big 1 hour roundup for the 3-1 in the week. And they did it the same way they did it with some startup money. So they're kind of quite conventional business models when you think about them. It's just the numbers have to be smaller to work. I don't know how much how many people download Romaniacs a week. Probably 30,000, 40,000 maybe. But there's significant advertising attached to that number.
Yeah, but it won't be. It's not more than that. I mean, it's not.
No.
It's not hundreds of thousands. You know, it's
Yeah.
in its own way, it's niche. You know.
But the other thing about it as well, Martin, is that then it becomes a volume business. So it becomes a bit like a newspaper, which is a newspaper didn't make a lot of money. A daily newspaper, like a regional paper, didn't make a lot of money every single day. But if you publish it 364 days a year, then it makes significant amount of money. And so then you're into the kind of the area of, well, how much content do you produce when you turn this into a company? If you've got a good idea for a Liverpool or Northwest-based podcast, the new frontier is not recording one podcast a week. It's producing multiple podcasts a week and trying to integrate that into the kind of live show or live event type of arm as well. And also, you really have to get under the bonnet of the front end or the back end. So your content management is really important. So you got to think about, are you maximizing your kind of Google ad revenue? Are you maximizing potential partnerships with whoever your host is? So, you know, in that case, in many ways, if I was offering anybody any advice, is that, you know, go and learn how Google makes its money. Go and look at YouTube and go and look at how people drive. Not the old golden days of YouTube are gone now, unless you're like kind of really creepy Russian toddler who's opening stuff up. God love you, Martin. You look like you're close to the cold there. But go and look at how digital revenue is accrued, how you make digital revenue through, you know, your algorithmic footprint, your partnership with Google, your partnership with Podcast Network. You know, most of the podcast, again, you know, it's as simple as they're working on very simple demographics. Is this podcast normally listened to by blokes? Yes. Sell them grooming, sell them beer, sell them undies, and similar for an all-female audience, like, you know. So that's one thing that says, if you're thinking about podcasting as a commercial entity, think about that commercial area. The other thing I didn't speak about there, Martin, I think is really important, is that people who are working in community-based enterprises or people who are working with third sector or charitable sector, a podcast is quite a cheap and easy way of building extra footprint for yourself in those, and being able to explain who and what you are. It can be quite niche and quite esoteric, that kind of area, but it just builds the kind of digital footprint, and it builds the appreciation that people in the outside world have for your business or for your organization. Excuse me.
Well, Paddy has a breath. Just say, so this sort of thing you're describing of the podcast as a business it's not a global business. It's a good business for you, right? It's like that. If you've ever watched that bit, if you're in Dragon's Den, right? When somebody comes into Dragon's Den and says, I would like £100,000 for 0.5% of my business, right? And the business is basically making pies in their kitchen, right? And they all listen to the numbers and say, that's all very nice. That's lovely. This is a business for you that will work for you, that will produce a nice salary for you, right? Or pin money for you, or whatever it might be. But it's that kind of business. It's not a business for an investor or an outside person to come and say, I'm going to buy this and make big numbers. Because the investor makes money out of big numbers, right? Exactly. By selling pies to everybody in the world, right? But if you're only ever going to sell 300 pies, then it's a good business for you. It's not a good business for an investor. And knowing when enough is an important thing, right? So knowing that you've got a podcast that has 1,000 listeners, they're all paying you £2, then that's good, and that's that's enough.
Yeah, and I suppose just reflecting on Daniel's question before, it sort of late capitalism for whatever it is lacks imagination, but that's how it works. And everything has now turned into a celebrity vehicle, because that kind of, that form of sort of media capitalism always worked on. You think about the music business, it's always worked on throw enough shit at the wall and see what's going to stick, hasn't it? So you sign, in the old music business model, you sign 40 bands and hope 3 of those are going to go pay dirt. I'm one of those. So in the mid-90s, remember John Niven? I don't know if you follow John Niven on Twitter, the great Estelle Costanza, one of the foulest mouthed Scottish men on Twitter. He's brilliant. But John was an A&R man he wrote that book, Kill Your Friends, which was turned into a film. And he described it as being an A&R man in the music industry in the mid-1990s. At a time when there was already existing Radiohead, Oasis, Blur, and the Manic Street Preachers. They would still regularly, as the official bit of the music industry, non-independent music industry, would sign 40 bands every year, just in the off chance that 2 or 3 of them might have the possibility of becoming big. Because as you say, the investors in limited companies like record companies, whatever, they're in a constant state of development. They're constantly searching for what the new thing's going to be, and they'll sign a lot of stuff, a lot of bands, or they'll produce a lot of content, hoping that just one is a success. But if you're a small kind of kitchen table podcasting business, you don't have that luxury, because you don't have those margins. You don't have, it's never going to be massive. And then of course, then you have to also think about pricing as well, Martin, which is, there's a sort of pricing scheme now where, you can afford, for instance, they can afford to give away James Acaster and Ed Gamble talking about what they ate this week with somebody, or Josh Widdicombe and Rob Beckett, because probably whoever their management companies are able to subsidize a platform like that, or a vehicle for those people, because it's a really brilliant marketing, always on marketing strand, that there's always going to be someone downloading that. So although the costs aren't that big for producing a podcast like that, that's okay, because somebody else can provide that. Whereas if you're trying to make your way with a podcast about crafting, or a podcast about, I always use the example, in sports journalism, one of the areas that really has benefited greatly from the podcast revolution is combat sports, where, even though they're quite big, boxing and UFC are still quite marginalized in the mainstream sports media in terms of day-to-day. Football dominates everything. Cycling is another one. They have benefited greatly from the podcasting revolution, because people are able to build and maximize significant following from what were small numbers. Exactly where the threshold of their success is going to be, which is something you don't often hear in the media business. Okay, that's okay. We're not going any bigger. Don't write. I never worked for a newspaper or a magazine or a radio station who didn't think there wasn't just a little bit more to be taken out of that market, just a wee bit more, and that's often to their detriment, that they miss the core of what they do, and they try and they overextend themselves. And the good podcasting, the good on-demand businesses understand how not to overextend themselves, I think.
Paddy and I could talk about sports podcasting all night. You don't want that. Is anybody got a question for Paddy while we've still got him? I promised his missus would let him go by past.
Don't worry, it's just chilling on downstairs.
Do you know what's
Sorry,
do you
go
know
ahead,
what's
Megan.
no, you go, because mine isn't actually a question, so mine's just babbling.
Mine's just a really quick one, Paddy. Is Atletico Mint going to make it into your book talking about football podcasts or not?
It would if there was. I might mention gangs of the EPL.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I might mention Steve McLaren and Casper the Snake.
I mean, that is something that is, as they say, a football podcast that's 5% football, and the rest just absolute nonsense. But
if you listen to this, but if you had to explain to someone that, like, Bob Mortimer was doing, like, Harry Kane and Dele Alli as the gangs of the EPL, I mean, at the socially distanced sports bar, it's just like three Welsh guys talking about clips from YouTube. But sometimes it might take them 45 minutes to get to the clip, and they'll just say to themselves, "Oh, I love sports," because they've not spoken about sports whatsoever before they get there. It's a brilliant podcast. I really recommend. Yeah, the book's more about fan podcasts. The book's called the culture and politics of British football fandom. And one of the things is just looking about that explosion in fan-made stuff for fans. If you think about Liverpool, if you come from Liverpool, as you sound like you do, just think about things like hat, scarf, or badge, which is like fans decided that that t-shirt companies and Fred Perry and people were ripping them off. So you've got this whole subculture of people just making gear for themselves. I support Celtic. I've got a season ticket. I get up for most Saturday and Sunday, 3 o'clock, or if it's on a Saturday, Sunday, I'll get there. We'll drive up or we'll get the train. And the whole subculture of people making their own clothes is very much like punk. It's very much like the subcultural stuff that people do around music and that kind of stuff, and that it's not corporately sponsored. It's not like, the way people who are, I'm sorry if you're a nerd or a geek, I'm sorry, I'm going to offend you now. But people who think that, they're Marvel fans and they think that and they go to Comic-Con and they still think there's some kind of oppressed minority. Geeks have the entire world. You've got Sheldon Cooper, Marvel, Star Wars, Harry Potter. Capitalism's really, really extracting a lot of money out of you. It's deeply corporate. There's nothing individual or kind of. It started off that way. Don't get me wrong. So I still think that there's a kind of. I think about podcasting, suppose, if I'm being honest, from a subcultural point of view, Daniel. That is like it's the stuff that the book on Irish Republican activism is about. The stuff that's left of the dial. The stuff that I always start from the margins and work in. And I think podcasting is a great way of starting from the margins and working in and understanding subculture and understanding how small markets work.
Megan, you had a question not about Atletico Mints.
It wasn't a question. It was just a weird, not weird. It was not even weird. Just an observation of from when you asked at the beginning, what podcasts do we listen to?
Yeah.
And then I gave kind of, this sporadic, this, I do that. Yeah. And it was only when you were speaking and talking about habit and everything, I went, that's absolute bullshit. There's 2 other ones that I listen to almost religiously now before bedtime when I'm getting ready for bed. That I didn't even realize that I do it because it's come a habit, and it's like Think Fast, Talk Smart, and also TED Talks Daily, little ones, just to try and put. Because I know I'm an overthinker, so I kind of get myself to put on a certain thing instead.
Yeah.
And when you asked me, I don't even think about that, but it's when you was talking habits, and then you asked us you were saying about the phone, so I looked onto my phone and I was like, they're the 2 main ones I listen to, but when you asked me, I don't even consider them to be. Yeah. It doesn't come as my first thought, if you know what I mean. So that was interesting to think how it just becomes an automatic reaction of, if you know what I mean. It's just just an observation. It's not,
No, I think you're right. And the interesting thing about that, Megan, is that I've worked in newspapers. I've worked a wee bit in radio and wee bits and pieces in digital businesses and whatnot. And I've been a freelance writer. I worked at university for a long time now. I was freelancing as a production journalist, an old school production journalist, until 2019 before COVID was. But every single one of us involved in journalism, which is my bit, whatever that journalism means, or whether it's making television, it is about trying to make what you make a habit for the people who are consuming it. Because habit is, I'm an overthinker too. And I also think recently a friend of mine who's a psychologist reckons I got a wee bit of ADHD.
I think I've been told that quite a few times.
And habits are very hard. I find habits very hard to break. And whenever I start listening to a podcast like the Socially Distant Sports Bar, I just found 3 weeks ago, I've listened to 60 of them in less than 2 weeks. Yeah. But I do stuff that that I go out and walk, or I'm in work. I always have my headphones in, or like you, before I go to bed, I'll put my headphones in because I don't sleep very well for the same reasons you do. You don't as well. And I think that whenever that podcast is aligned with that intimacy, people don't actually really believe they're actually involved in. I don't listen to anything. As you said, I don't listen to anything. And then when you think, I do.
Yeah.
Not the old habit that we built, which was in the old pre-digital days where we all sat down in front of the television at a certain time as a family and watched the same stuff at the same time every week, and you chart your week around EastEnders or Brookside or Corrie or, or the Saturday night appointment television, that might be going away. But now with on demand, we've got a different set of habits, and they work slightly differently than they used to. And the industry's trying to pivot around that notion of on demand. People can have what they want, when they want, how they want them. And I suppose it's understanding the people you're speaking to, because podcasting is really easy in one way, which is like, you listen to Martin's podcast, it's brilliant. It's just him or somebody interesting in a room talking in a really deep way. And it's how you turn that out, that intimacy with that habit, and that becomes really important. Like, you can transfer that across a lot of businesses, because you're trying to get people to habitually buy what you're selling, and you're always selling something, even if you're giving it away for free.
Yeah.
But I love those wee TED Talks. They're great, aren't they?
Yeah, they're really good. And it's nice that they can be short, because otherwise I will just sit there and listen and not go to bed. If it was an hour long, I would be waiting for it. I wouldn't switch it off halfway through. So it's nice that they can be like 10 minutes or like 20 minutes.
But again, that speaks to something about style and content, doesn't it? It says something about how you have to think about the shape of what you're doing. So, in the olden days, whenever I helped redesign newspapers, we always had an audience in mind. And sometimes we invented audiences. Like, this is family X from Bootle. They earn this much money and they watch these programs, and your paper has to speak to them. And so we chose our typefaces and our colors and the whole format of the newspaper to fit in with that audience. And we poured content into that design every day. Well, before you think about the film you're making, the YouTube channel you're making, the podcast that you're making, you've got to think about the shape of the thing that people want to consume. And in your case, it might be 10-minute snapshots just for bed to help you sleep. And that's as valuable as 1.5 hour deep dives with someone. And we don't all have to listen to the same thing all the time. The really depressing thing about TV is TV's really formatted. So they're half an hour or 2 hours, and everything's kind of like the same shape, and it looks and tastes the same way. Panel shows all just do the same thing. Whereas podcasts can be all different sizes and shapes, and we can consume all those different sizes and shapes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like I haven't had TV we haven't had TV in our house for about 5 years, 6 years maybe. I got rid of TV. But we do have a physical TV and DVD player, and obviously watch some stuff online. But I forgot what I was saying. Still say something about my kids, like it kind of changes the way they intake stuff of what you're saying with the specific format, and then they've learned to format things, not format things. They've learned to intake in a different way, because they haven't had that. Really, sorry, I completely forgot what I was saying as I was saying it then.
What you're saying is that you don't parent via Nickelodeon or Disney Channel.
They still found YouTube though. You cannot get away from it. It doesn't matter what you do. Well, I've done a really good job, and then there's like YouTube. Even like what happens?
I was deeply unpopular in this house. My daughter's 21 now, but I was deeply unpopular because I took the Disney Channel out. Because I just watched like The Sweet Life of whatever that was called, or Hannah Montana. It was the same thing over and over and over and over again. It was like it wasn't because it was like homogenous. It wasn't because it was American or it was Disney. It was just deeply boring. I just wanted to see something else. But
yeah, it gets really boring, and it's also I think I do believe a bit in the brainwashing, but not literally. Like I do think that it's just a lot of one side of stuff and one way to make you. It's sort of like fairy tales. Look, and here's your prince, and now you've done this, and it's all the same thing. Putting this process into our lives. So it's better if you can. I want to teach them to choose what they're intaking.
Yeah. Daniel was asking you, by the way, on the chat, what that first podcast was you listened to. Oh,
sorry, I just wasn't even reading. The other one I started listening to for a little while now is called Think Fast, Talk Smart. It's by someone from Stanford, a professor or something, and some of them short, and he'll have guests and interview them. about different techniques and stuff, and then he'll have 3 questions at the end that he always asks every person, so you get to hear what all of their answers are for the same 3 questions each time. Like some of the titles are stuff like space, pace and grace, how to handle challenging conversations and things like that. And just lots of different ways to talk. Some of it's about talking publicly or in little small situations like this, or lots of different things. And then he'll have I think it's been going on quite a while. I'm a bit newer to it, but like I said, I've started like religiously listening. Just they're about 22 minutes, 23 minutes long each. I'm just looking through them. Some are a little bit longer, but they're not much longer. And then he has a few mini ones that are like just 9 minutes as well. Yeah.
I think
Do you want me to type it in there? Sorry, should I type it?
Stick it in the chat there, mate.
Let me see. Sorry, my brain is not working very well today. I don't know what I'm doing. I think that. Oh, no, that's not the right one. Well, it'll come up there in a second. So I've just switched on something else by accident. Then I got fast. It's just that. That's literally just the title of it. It's got like. Oh wait. It's like that, the red one.
Okay.
With a little speech bubble and brain thing. I don't even know how it came up. It's on Spotify that I found it. I don't even know how I got it.
You see, that's interesting because I'd love to talk to some people. I'd love to maybe do a bit of research about this at some point in the future, and I'll try and understand how you're out. So do Spotify users find podcasts a different way than I do as an Android user? I do use Spotify, but
I'm on Android as well. I'm on Android, and honestly, I think that one came up because of TED Talks Daily, and so I do think it found me because of that one. It sometimes just sort of says, it goes. You have a few things to listen to, so your music and everything, and then it'll have your shows, and it'll sort of say recently. It'll say something like recommended stations or things that I like. So it would have said things that I like TED Talk Daily, and that's where it came up. And I think I just literally one day randomly clicked on it, and it just happened to be. I was just lucky that it was good.
Yeah.
Well,
that's interesting. You've got to make stuff that's a bit like other stuff because that's how people get to stuff. If that that with the football collective podcast, I kind of like always think that I'm doing the football weekly, really, Martin, or I'm trying to do one of those kind of like. I worked in radio, and I love talking to people. I love listening to people. I love having conversations with people. So just like it to sound like you're just listening to somebody in a pub, or you're earwigging in a really interesting conversations. I always try and have them as. But the other thing is, but because of algorithm and the nature of the algorithmic world, as you're pointing out there, Megan, it also has to fit in with something else for other people to find you. And because if they don't, then it becomes kismet. You're just relying on a series of kind of multiple accidents, and that the internet doesn't work on multiple accidents. The internet works on, especially algorithmic things like Facebook, social media, or YouTube or Spotify. They work on the aggregation of billions of people's habits to be able to tailor that and push stuff to people.
Yeah, I find it quite hard sometimes thinking about that side because I can see it very clearly, but I also know that you're still in your bubble, aren't you? So even if you know that algorithm exists, you're in your bubble, and then it's the same as if you only read certain newspapers, but to get a full picture you need to read more of those other ones, sort of thing. And you can trick it. Like I don't think Instagram knows who I am. I think I've tricked them into. I think they don't think that I'm a white woman or whatever. I don't think they know that. I don't think they've managed to figure that out because I get some really random stuff, and I'm thinking, okay. But then on other certain things, yes, it's just weird. How do they decide on what are they picking up on to make that happen? And how much of it is them selecting through what they want to push, or literally from what you are speaking about, or what's listening in or what is typed and stuff. My brain's got loads of different thoughts going in and I can't get it out of my mouth properly, but it's just like I just get confused sometimes about how it because sometimes I can see it so clearly of it being them, and sometimes I can see that you can trick it, and I'm wondering how do you then gauge of the general public who is tricking it, who is following, like how do you be the same as this but you want to have that edge because you need to be, like you said, the same to get into that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I remember years ago that whenever the internet really first, I was working in a newsroom when the internet first hit. I was working in the Liverpool Echo newsroom and Daily Post in there, and we had a television business, and we had a bit of a nascent, internet business. And I remember the philosopher king then was the SEO writer. So the search engine optimization writer was the person that everyone, they've got the secret to the internet. They know how to write all the words. And then we realized that SEO wasn't really all that. It was just a way of, prominent words in the right place as a means of being able to learn stuff. So I think you've got to think about the production of, certainly about the production of podcasts now, almost like kind of SEO. I suppose that's maybe a point to answer Daniel's question, his first question, which is that, if you were SEOing up or you were thinking about the keywords, what's going to sell? What are people searching for in the short, medium, and long term? What has kind of legs? Everyone can record one podcast, which is really interesting, but what we're talking about here is how do you develop a sustainable idea?
Yeah.
How do you, a sustainable idea that people can find and people can enjoy? And, in the case of like a kind of live events business that people want to go and pay money to see, and they want to go out to a theater or they want to go to a fair or something, and they want to, you drive revenue in more diverse ways. So it's about cracking that kind of code. Is that, what's the slice of pie that you need to make it worthwhile, and how do you reach those people? How do you game the system, as you're talking about, Megan, or how do you understand the architecture of an algorithmic world that you reach people?
The other thing you've got to be prepared to do is feed the beast.
Yeah.
As we said in the past, if you're running a podcast, you need new content. A lot of the time, you don't need to run a podcast every week, right? That's just one model of a podcast that people have got lots of resources. But even if you do a series of 10 episodes, you've got to have 10 lots of content. And the third series, the fourth series, right? You've got to keep feeding this. And it's a kind of, you can stop after 3 series, right? There's no reason why a podcast goes on forever. But you've got to feed the beast. You've got to find new content all the time.
Yeah, and the net
and
the point about the net, Mark, is that the internet is completely ravenous. You can never fill the internet. It'll just gobble up content insatiably. I love Celtic Football Club. I love going to see the match. I've occasionally written articles about Celtic in various different places. But I can't think of, Mark, I just see the idea of having to sit down 7 days a week and record a podcast about something that might or may not have happened at my football. I would very quickly tire of that if that became my job.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything more tedious than, that I very quickly come to hate the thing that I probably love most in the world beyond my family.
And on that bombshell, Paddy, we'd literally, Paddy and I could talk about this all night, right? Which we don't want. We don't want. We've been at this for nearly 2 hours, Paddy. I mean, amazing stuff. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Absolutely.
I'll just stick my email address in the chat there, and if anybody wants any questions or anything, absolutely no hassle to send me an email and we can chat or go for a cup of coffee or something. But it's that's my new work email, so just bang it through.
That's his new work email with his new friends.
Sorry, boss.
I'm delighted you're there, Paddy. Great stuff. So what we'll do now is we will take a break. We'll let Paddy go to his family that he professes to love, although he spends all his time in his study podcasting. And then when we come back, we'll hear from Phil, his thoughts about podcasting and everything else. So what we'll do, what is it now? It's now, which country are we in today? Today is 7 o'clock, right? It's 7 o'clock. So we'll come back at 7:15 and hear a bit from Phil, and then we'll call it a day for Easter holidays. Oh, and any other spring break stroke other Easter holidays you may have in mind, right? Okay,
nice,
so
folks. All the best. Thanks to meet you.
See you. Thanks, Paddy. Thanks for
all
having
the
me.
best. We'll get for a pint soon, Mark. Okay.
Yeah, I'll see you soon.
Nice,
okay.
All the best. Good luck.
Who have we got? Who can I see? See Michelle. Who else? Who else? Phil, are you there?
Yes, I am, Martin.
Ah, there you are. How are you, dear heart?
I'm not bad, thank you. I'm a little bit tired. It's been a very busy day. It doesn't feel like I had much of a weekend, but I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, no, good. All good.
Good.
Do you listen to podcasts?
Do I listen to podcasts? I do. I listen to quite a lot of podcasts, actually. I was just flicking through my library of podcasts, which I have on Spotify, simply because I can get most of them in one place, and I have a few on BBC Sounds I kind of subscribe to, so I just don't lose track of when they update. I listen to Malcolm Gladwell he has a really interesting podcast. Which interestingly has a free version and a subscription version, but I think you can only subscribe in the States. But it's interesting how he has those two kind of options. So for someone like me, I can just tune in for free. The audio long read, How to Invent a Country, Revisionist History. There's one here called Lonely Arts Club. I mean, it's made it up here, but I haven't actually listened to any of them, but it's there, and it's very colourful. Margins of Error, Social Europe podcast, Forethought, Sideways. In Pod We Trust is a particular favourite of mine. If only for the title, I can't even remember what it's about. So that's just a selection.
American politics.
Sorry?
American politics.
Politics?
American politics.
Even better. Even better. That must be how it made it into my... The one that I think is most relevant, though, as a starting point for the second half, is Test Match Special. That I would argue, I mean, I am white, I am male, I am a certain age, so, you know, I'm the old-fashioned target demographic. But what I would say is that they've been doing conversational commentary for about 50 years, the vast majority of which had absolutely nothing to do with the sport that they were supposed to be commentating on, and have gathered an enormous following of people who are interested in cricket, people who are interested in just having something on in the background, people who are interested in, you know, just became interested. And what is, and I'll use the word interesting again because I haven't used it enough, is that spawned some sub-genres. So there's now, for women's cricket, there's now a Test Match Special podcast called No Balls, which again, I think is a fabulous name for a Test Match Special podcast, particularly if you understand the rules of cricket, maybe not so much if you don't. And so there's now about 4 or 5 different sub-podcasts of the main Test Match Special brand, as it were. So it's appealing to lots of people through lots of channels, in addition to, if you like, the live kind of commentary version. And that's been going forever. It's reinvented itself with commentators, with different with different kind of interest groups and different types of cricket. The thing about football, of course, for people supporting successful teams is, as I've said before, where is the fun in that? And where's the fun in listening to a podcast of kind of self-congratulatory smug people talking about the fact that their teams are excellent? There's no angst there. Says the Sunderland supporter, which is maybe why I follow cricket, but that's, you know. Anyway, so I just thought I'd share that as a starter for 10 before we get started properly.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you for that. What are you offering tonight?
Mm.
in the world.
I shall check my notes. What am I offering tonight? So I want to talk about, it's very, very, again, luck or judgment, it's very, very good fit with what we've just heard. It's what I really want to talk a little bit about is client acquisition, customer engagement, customer acquisition. How do you go and build an audience or build a following or build a whatever? And actually, a lot of that's been talked about. So I'm going to try not to duplicate or replicate. As people that know me from the last however many episodes of this, a lot of the things that we talk about are connected. Finding an audience, keeping an audience, finding your tribe, your community, etc. So I was very pleased to hear those kind of terms come out again, because they are the key. So really, it's about an audience. It's about what do you want from them? How do you find them? How do you keep them? Getting some questions from our audience here. Nobody wants to hear me talk for too long. So yes, customer acquisition, sort of lead gen, business generation. How do you generate that interest? How do you generate those people? What will get them to come? And a few examples I've seen that I thought were interesting, that may or may not be directly relevant to what people are doing, but hopefully will, if you like, shine a light or be examples that will get people thinking about themselves and what they're looking to achieve.
Excellent, right? So, in your own time, Phil.
Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about boredom, right? Boredom's really important, because boredom, says this mid-50s white, middle-class, middle-aged male, I think historically was the root of creativity. Social and digital media fills the space where boredom used to be, and I think dulls creativity to a certain extent. And the reason I want to talk about boredom and social media, of course, is content fills that space where boredom used to be. So as a child of the 70s, somebody once said to me that being bored staring out of the window, waiting for the TV to fire up 2 or 3 times of a week was a good sort of precursor to what it was like to be an adult, living long periods of boredom between kind of set piece events like weddings, births, bar mitzvahs, deaths, and the like. Now, of course, we can't be bored for a second. Every second has to be filled with something. Even relaxation has to be filled with a podcast that explains how to relax. Now, of course, I'm being partly facetious. And partly I'm trying to sort of demonstrate a point, which is that there is an audience out there, such as there has never been an audience out there before. And that audience gives you lots of clues, because they're there and you can find them. And as I've said before, I think on the first conversation that we had, is you can go and do a lot of desk research on the social media platform of your choice, or on the World Wide Web, or elsewhere, and find what audiences are interested in. I mean, Pinterest, which is not, if you like, live media, although now it's been sold. I believe it's now about to become monetized, but that's full of people who have loads and loads of different interest groups. It encourages people to join lots and lots of different groups, to kind of share ideas and interesting cheats and tips and whatever, and it caters for all manner of different groups of people and the things that they are interested in. So there's never been more research opportunity out there for you to find your audience, what they like, and where they're having that conversation. I think I've said that before, but it does no harm to reiterate that. And of course, if you're going to generate demand, you're going to need to know where that conversation is happening, which platform, where. I'll come back also to amplification, which I've mentioned before, because once you know where and once you know who, and it was mentioned earlier about partnering, it's not just your voice, it's the voice of people who are similar to you or next door to you or adjacent to you, that you can help them and they can help you. And so together you can build an audience quicker than you might be able to build one yourself. So I've made some notes. I might have to put my glasses on to actually read them. Before you do that though, what do you want? Now, there's a lot of focus on the first half this evening about monetizing, and I've got nothing against monetizing, but it may not be the goal for everyone. And if I go all the way back to the first week where we had Emma Case talking about photography, part of what she was doing was monetization, wedding photography. Part of it was community engagement, and part of it was a mixture of both. The first thing I think you've got to do is work out where you are in that continuum. It's okay to be in more than one place, but understanding where you are and what you're looking to achieve will also drive to a certain extent who you're looking to engage, and critically, why you're looking to engage them, what you're looking to engage them with. So without wishing to go back into the kind of long grass of the business plan, it's really worthwhile thinking about, what do you want? Is it, I want 200 subscribers at £5 a month? Is it, I want 100 followers who are interested in the same thing as me? Is it, I'm an artist and I want an audience and feedback for people who might like the poetry I write? I'm not necessarily looking for them to pay me money. I'm looking for them to enjoy what I produce. All of those are valid, and they're not, they don't exclude one another, but working out where you are on that for your business or your creative endeavor, or your podcast. A podcast is a creative endeavor. It's interesting to talk about podcasts. Podcasts can be, if you like, part of a marketing strategy, or it can be all of what you do. And it's very interesting to think about content and how you distribute content through multiple channels, but also thinking about, if you like, the practice of whether you are a podcaster or whether you are a painter or whether you are a graphic. Do you know what I mean? So there's the medium, and there's also, if you like, the kind of technical skill or ability or interest as well. And those two things cross over. So today was very much podcasting from the point of view, from a business point of view, as something to monetize something else. So a channel as much as an end in itself. So going back to I'm going to have to put my glasses on, so I apologize for that. I should wear them all the time. I wonder why. Okay, tribe, community, audience. We've talked about this loads and loads and loads of times. Research. They are out there. And they probably are closer than you think. You may already be engaging with them. Again, this is something I've mentioned many times before. Once you've found them, research what they like and why they like it. I know it's a really, really obvious thing to say, but I go back to an example of the glass maker whose glass I collected, who showed me all the pieces of glass he could never sell because they were all different, and what people wanted was the same. And what's really interesting is a football podcast about three blokes talking about football is just that. If they turned up one week and started talking about beer, it would not be the football podcast. So people tend to want more of the same. They tend to want to be kind of almost ground in sameness. So once you build that niche, whatever it is, and that's quite an irony, given that artistic practice is not necessarily built around doing the same thing over and over and over again. But this guy showed me all the stuff he couldn't sell, and it was beautiful. He said, once I got a reputation for doing this particular thing, that's what people expected of me, and that's what people wanted to buy. I think that's a really worthwhile and interesting insight. So you'll find your audience, but don't be surprised if they just want more of the same every week or every month or every time. What will they pay for and what won't they pay for? There's an interesting thing about content and kind of demand generation, is that sometimes you give away your best stuff. And giving away your best stuff for free is what convinces people that you're genuine, and what convinces people to trust you, and what convinces people to come back. And if you're looking to monetize in terms of driving advertising revenue, what you want is a larger number of people to engage, because that's what will encourage an advertiser to pay you, because you've then got that channel. So again, going back to what I said just before about why are you doing this, sometimes you'll want to give away your best stuff because that's what will drive numbers, which will drive a particular type of commercial opportunity. Sometimes you absolutely don't want to give away your best stuff. and examples of things that people do. I was watching something not so long ago, and there was a woman standing in a field demonstrating different ways or different component parts of training sheepdogs. Now, it's quite niche, but she's got a YouTube channel, and people pay about £10 a month, and there's about 1,000 of them. Because there's 1,000 people in the world who are interested in training sheepdogs. I mean, the numbers may or may not be right, but the point is, they're small numbers, but that makes it a viable thing. And what does she do? She puts up so many videos every month or every week about different elements of, you've got a sheepdog and this is what you do next to train it from here to here. And a tenner, if you're serious about something and that's really, really, really your thing, is not a huge amount of money. It's still a lot of money, and for most people it's going to be pence at 49p, 99p. But as was said earlier, if you have, I don't know, 100 people all paying a couple of quid a week, that's £1,000. No, it's not. It's £800 a month. Maths isn't any good today either. Nothing much is working for me mentally today. You'll be pleased to hear. But the point is that there are audiences out there for all sorts of things who are prepared to pay, but you need to understand what they will pay for, what they won't pay for, and marry that up with what you're prepared to give away, if anything, and not. And there's no right or wrong answer. The research will guide you, the engagement with similar will guide you, and what you're trying to achieve will guide you. I want to take a moment to talk about Angry Birds, which is obviously the next segue. You can tell this is kind of somewhat sort of scatter, but it does kind of fit. So, fact about Angry Birds, it took 23 months for Angry Birds to reach 500 million downloads. That's less than 2 years. Now, admittedly, that's a game with birds and pigs. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute you should recreate that or even run a podcast, because that would be quite interesting. But the point I suppose I want to make about this is where you're starting from now, this might feel like a very big ask and a very large challenge. And I think some of that was free, so they gave a lot of it away. And even when they were charging, they were literally charging something like 49p a month when they first started. So it wasn't a big deal for people. It was something that was very easy for people to sign on to. It wasn't a big commitment. It gave them a lot of joy, shooting stuff or hitting stuff. It seems that shooting and killing stuff is what a lot of people like to do online. Not me, but a lot of others. But I think it's a really 23 months for 500 million. That's a lot of people in a short space of time. That's the point I want to make. So measurement, adapting. Once you've found what it is that you're prepared to do, the audience you want to engage with, and they're engaging with you, what you need to do is measure. So we talked about Google Analytics. It is well worth getting up to speed with whatever analytics are available, mainly for free on whatever platform you choose to use, because it will tell you how long people are there for. It will tell you what pages, if it's a website they're looking at, it will tell you the hang time. You can then compare how long, how many pages they've looked at, how easy it was for them to get from where they started to where they spent most of their time. And you can adapt your proposition accordingly so that you keep them for longer, or you direct them better to where it is you want them to go. So measuring, adapting, trialing, measuring, always measuring. So you need to know what it is that people are doing, why they're liking, what they're liking. Sometimes actually very old-fashioned asking. If it's podcast, if it's one-on-one engagement, if it's a creative endeavor where you're doing something for somebody and you're engaging face-to-face or engaging personally, then just ask people what they like and what they don't like. People will tell you. People might even tell you without asking them, but people will tell you. And what I've said this before, the reason they like something is very unlikely to be the reason you do it. So why you do something and why they either pay for it or enjoy it or recommend it to friends or whatever, and be open to the fact that once it becomes, if it is a commercial enterprise, or if it's whether it's commercial or artistic, just be open to adapting to what it is the audience is looking for, or being prepared to find a different audience if you're not prepared to adapt it for that audience. And then finally, again, coming back to amplification, the shortcut: find others that are doing something similar, look at their audience, I mean, I go on mailing lists for competitors. I want to see what they're producing. I want to see how they're producing it. I want to see how easy or difficult it is to get hold of. I want to see what their sources are. There's a whole load of things you can do by just joining a mailing list, or listening to a podcast with an eye to presenting one, or going online and looking for someone who's I don't know, blogging in a similar way to how you want, or just blogging in a way that you don't want to blog. But you can go and join, but instead of having the eye of the consumer or the ear of the consumer, have the eye of the competitor or the producer or the creative or the designer, the developer, whichever. I would normally, if it was for a business, be looking at a little matrix of no more than 3 competitors, i.e. people who do something similar to what I do or what I think I might want to do, what I think they do well, what they're not doing that I can do that I think people might like, what they're doing better than I can currently do. Now, some of this will apply more to businesses and creative enterprises, that's for sure. But if you're, I don't know, selling jewelry online, for example, or you're creating your own range, there'll be other people out there doing something similar. And even if the design of what they do is not the same as yours, you might pick something up in the way they're marketing that, in the way people are engaging with it. I mean, below the line comments on newspapers have become kind of, I don't know, 70% of what newspapers do. Being open to inviting people to comment on what you do gives them an opportunity to engage, and also gives you an opportunity to engage with them. So look at the competition, go and subscribe, particularly if it's free, to something, and just see what that kind of client experience is like. Become a customer and see what that's like, and see what you like and what you don't like about it. And use that as a guide as to how you set yourself up. I feel like I've rambled a little bit. I hope that makes some sense, maybe more than some sense. I'm going to pause and invite questions there.
Any questions for Phil on building your audience? Can I ask you, Phil, about giving stuff away for free?
Yes.
Which is the thing we've gone around before. And I used a phrase last week talking with Claire Barry about top of the funnel. Right? I said, what is it that got people interested in you, Claire? Top of the funnel is you come for the swearing. Right? At the top of the funnel is, if you imagine subscriptions works like this, right? You want subscribers. You got to suck people in. So you've got to bring people near the top of the funnel, right? So that might be giving away something for free that they engage with, right? And then they engage with you, and in the middle of the funnel, they're reading your stuff, they're interested in you, watching your videos, listening to your podcasts. You get them all the way down bottom of the funnel, where they're paid subscribers. Right? Now, not everybody gets there, obviously. Some people, more people up here than you've got down at the bottom. But say you think about subscriptions, sort of subscription business. One way of doing that is giving away stuff for free. But you can't give all your best stuff away for free all the time. Otherwise, nobody would ever make it to the bottom of the funnel. But
this is the example of this is the example of swearing. It's the counter example. So what Claire did last week was she gave the example of breaking all the rules to get attention. Ordinarily, and this is where we started on week 1, we'd say you don't give your stuff away for free, you're creative, you should be paid. If it's part of a strategy where you want to monetize something, then it might make sense. It won't always make sense, but the point is you've got to have a strategy at the beginning as to what you want and how much you think you will convert from the top to the bottom. And you've got to be realistic about what it is you think. Now, one of the things you can do, as an example, that's giving valuable stuff away for free, but isn't giving away, if you like, your core proposition, is things like how-to guides. So I was watching David Attenborough yesterday, or someday, and you'll notice that there's a 1 hour documentary, and 50 minutes of the documentary is the wildlife documentary. And the last 10 minutes is how you make the wildlife documentary. When I say best stuff, one of the ways of giving away the best stuff without giving away the best stuff is doing the 10-minute how I did this documentary. There's a mountainous audience out there who don't just want to, I don't know, buy the poetry or subscribe. They want to know how it's done. And so one of the things you can, if you like, in inverted commas, give away or offer is the, not the secret sauce, but the how-to. This is how I got from here to here. And if there was a little bit of that every week, you're almost tutoring is not the right word, because you're not teaching people to do what you do, but you're opening the curtain a little bit to show how it's done. And people do respond really well to that. So you're not giving away something they can use to stop paying you, but you're giving away something that makes that personal connection, which again was spoken about earlier, because you do need to be authentic. And I think that's a very good way, whether it's by YouTube or by podcast or in some other or Instagram or other social media, of engaging an audience, because there is a real appetite there. It's like, for example, you can go to the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and see the opera, but you can also become a member and go to the rehearsals. And there's now almost as many people pay £8 to go stand at the back and watch them rehearse for an hour as there are pay £50 to go and watch them actually perform the opera. So I'd look at it kind of that way.
Okay, very good.
And you can, and also because the other thing, sorry, Martin, the other thing is you need to create a lot of content. I think you said that earlier, and this is a very good way of creating a lot of content without giving away what you do.
Yeah. Diversifying your writing. Well, it's the old trick of writing once, publishing forever, right?
Well, I was just thinking, if you're making jewelry or if you are writing a poem, then you could do 5 minutes on, if it's making, it could be the technique of doing some of the making. If it's the writing, it could be some of the process of how I got from a blank page to, yeah? Sorry, Martin, you're breaking up on me.
Oh, yeah, I think my signal's quite poor. Do we have any questions for tonight? Any thoughts? Any interventions? Oh, the internet's still working for me. If we don't, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone, and thank you, and wish you all a pleasant spring break, Easter break, stroke your internet connection is unstable. That's why I'm being told. So we can stop here for he's not next week, but we're back the following. And we've got 2 sessions online and then a final wash up on campus after that. Have you lost me? I think everybody else is frozen.
We can hear you, but your lips aren't moving.
Right, okay, because you've all frozen for me. But you can hear me, that's fine. All right, great. Well, I'll see everyone in a fortnight. Good luck with your creative endeavours, and I'll see you soon. Have a great little break.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Martin.
Whatever you've got planned. Okay, I'll see you all later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.